evening. Yes, I came of age in the South, so we're going to try again. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you so much. My name is Megan McDowell. I'm an assistant professor in criminology and criminal justice. I'm also a facilitator of the Interrupting Harm Lab, which is a new initiative on campus sponsored by the Wurgler Chair. First, welcome to the third Just Safety Dialogue. So there was one at U of A, ASU, and now NAU. And I want to open by thanking all of you for being here. Why? Because you come here and you share with us the most precious resource we have, our time. The feminist civil rights and labor organizer Grace Lee Boggs was known for asking, "What time is it on the clock of the world?" Boggs was posing a question to us, yes, but I also think she was suggesting a method of analysis of how to think about our social world. She's asking us to pause, to study, and to take stock of the material conditions that are animating our lives. She's doing so in the spirit of not just asking a question or not just studying, but also developing a plan of action to act, not as individuals, but in concert together. I think we're gathering in a moment that I'm sure many of us agree is a critical conjuncture, critical point in history. There's questions about international solidarity, about human rights, about self-determination, and the theme that unites us here tonight, safety. Safety. We're holding the international demand for a ceasefire, Palestinians' call to abolish apartheid and to live free of occupation. This evening's dialogue that is facilitated by Just Communities Arizona, it will help us answer some of these questions in part by re-theorizing the meaning of safety. So we want to move away from these dominant conceptions of safety that are wed to aggression, to criminalization, to banishment, to police, and to prisons, and toward holistic understandings of safety that are community generated, that center things like repair, accountability, transformative justice, and our interconnectedness. This is not easy work, but it is necessary work. I'd like you to join me in welcoming tonight's moderator and also the executive director of Just Communities Arizona, Carolyn Isaacs.
So can you all hear me if I just talk at you regular? Mm-hmm. Don't need the mics. Oh, awesome. Okay. That's so much better. Thank you so much, Prof. Megan, for that introduction and situating us in this moment in which we find ourselves. As Megan mentioned, my name is Caroline Isaacs. I'm the Executive Director of Just Communities Arizona. And our mission is to create, foster, and resource community-based models for safety and justice outside the punishment system. This requires deep cultural change to expand the definition of safety beyond preventing and responding to crime to include meeting basic human needs, providing economic security, mental and behavioral health and wellness, and providing community cohesion and belonging. For too long, the concept of safety has been narrowly defined in the context of crime and punishment. We wait until something terrible happens, determine who is responsible, and punish them. But safety is so much more than not having your car broken into. If you're facing eviction, are you safe? If your child is experiencing substance use disorder or in a mental health crisis, is she safe? What our research reveals is that true safety is not just physical, but emotional and interpersonal. It is tied to health and wellness. It's having your basic needs met, your problem solved, your trusted relationships maintained. And it is created through community-level activism, just as much, if not more, than by government institutions. But the notion of public safety has been tied to criminalization and incarceration for so long that we have no concept, no vision for how we might create safety differently. The key to decoupling the notion of safety from punishment is to provide concrete examples of existing approaches that are producing positive outcomes. And that is why we are so excited to present to you tonight this incredible panel featuring representatives of national and local organizations that have developed innovative, holistic approaches to this expanded notion of safety. I don't know that I need to do a lot of housekeeping with you before we get started. I think you're all students here, you know where the bathrooms are, but for the rest of us, though, they're down the hall that way. Please grab some snacks. Lots of those available for you. And here's how tonight's gonna go. I'm gonna give a brief introduction of our panel, and then each of them will have about 5 minutes to talk to you about their definition of safety and how their work is creating that in the world. And then we'll jump in with some questions that I've prepared, and then we wanna hear your questions. And since it's like a pretty intimate venue tonight, I think we can dispense with the writing stuff on cards. We'll just raise your hand, we'll have a conversation. Is that good? All right. Without further ado, I am honored and excited to introduce our panelists for this evening. Haley Coles, in the middle here, Executive Director of Sonoran Prevention Works, is a diehard Arizonan, I gotta put that on my bios, committed to achieving health equity among people impacted by drug use and drug policy. Her personal experience with chaotic drug use and the devastatingly preventable loss of people she loved informs her personal mission to make meaningful structural change for a more just and healthy Arizona. She is the vice chair of the Aunt Rita's Foundation Board, is an alumna of the Robert Wood Johnson's Foundation Culture of Health Leaders program, received the 2018 Leadership in Advocacy Award from ASU, Center for Applied Behavioral Health Policy, go Cats, whatever, and has provided consultation for the National Association of State and Territorial AIDS Directors and the CDC. Welcome, Haley. On the end here, Mona Cadena is Director of Advocacy and Campaigns at Equal Justice USA. EJUSA is a national organization, oh my God, my thing went ahead, is a national organization that does cool stuff, that works to transform the justice system by promoting responses to violence that break cycles of trauma. It works at the intersection of criminal justice, public health, and racial justice to elevate healing over retribution, meet the needs of survivors, advance racial equity, and build community safety. Mona works with EJUSA staff and partners to reduce the harm of the current system and build transformational solutions to violence. Her work supports campaigns and organizing to end extreme sentences, build community-centered solutions to violence, and create systemic solutions for safe communities. She uses her expertise in community-based organizing and policy change to provide training, strategic guidance, and hands-on assistance to state and local legislative campaigns around the country. Welcome, Mona. And last but not least, to my immediate right, Christina Delgado is the Southwest Regional Advocacy Associate for the Community Justice Action Fund, a national advocacy coalition that promotes and invests in evidence-based policies and programs to prevent gun violence and uplift criminal justice reforms in urban communities of color. Christina turned to gun violence activism after her family and community experienced Texas's first school shooting in 2018 at Santa Fe High School. As she watched her friends grieve the death of their children, Christina's daughters reminded her that it could have been them. 4 years and 6 days later, she watched as Uvalde, Texas stood in the same place Christina and her community had. The days that followed revealed the disparities in response from the state of Texas between Santa Fe, a primarily Caucasian community, and Uvalde, a border community with a high Hispanic population. Christina joined the community justice team to help support and advocate for those affected by acts of gun violence in Black and Brown communities. So, you all are awesome. I'm so excited to hear from you. We don't have to go in any particular order, but let's just dive in and tell us about safety from your perspective. We can go in the same, we can go in the same order. Go ahead.
Also, you want me to start at the end?
Sure.
All right.
Great.
It's so nice to be here, everyone. So I'm just going to start. We are asked to answer the question, what does safety mean to us? And these are conversations that we have had with many of the partners who we work with. We've had them in small coffee shops. We've had this question on Zoom, and I think one of the things that continues to lift up for us is that what safety means, not just to me, but to so many people, is this idea of belonging, this idea of care, and how we can connect and build relationship to each other. So much of what you said in your intro, Caroline, and I think that was the same for me. When I think about my own neighborhood, and I live in a neighborhood called the Tenderloin in San Francisco, which if you've read any of the Doom Loop press, my neighborhood is the neighborhood that they are talking about. So my neighbors and I talk a lot about safety and what it means. And I think one of the things that we continue coming to is that safety is being in community and building community with each other. We know each other in our street, we know each other on our blocks. And it also means that we look out for each other because we know who is supposed to be there, and when we see someone who we haven't seen before, we want to make sure that they're welcome, and we want to make sure that they have the things that they need to thrive and be successful. I think one of the things we've seen so much in San Francisco is that when our community members don't have the tools that they need to be successful, that is where we start to see the situation, things deteriorating. And so, when we hold safety as both like belonging and caring for each other, then I think we start to see things change for all of us in our community. So just briefly, you talked a little bit about what EJUSA does. And our work really is that, we don't just want a world where violence is rare. We want a world where our neighborhoods are thriving and our communities are happy and excited to be together. And so our work does that in two particular ways. The first is by focusing on reducing the harm of the current system. We know that right now out in the world, the general idea is that justice is punishment. And we at EJUSA believe that justice should actually not be framed as punishment. It should be framed as safety and well-being. And so our work to reduce the harm of the current system is about trying to break that punishment paradigm. And so initially, it's really just focusing on those extreme sentences, ending the death penalty, ending solitary confinement, ending life without parole. And as we continue to move forward, really starting to as we break that punishment paradigm, asking the question, what happens after harm? And I think we'll probably get into this at some point, but when we ask questions of, to folks who have either committed harm and who have been harmed, when you ask people what they need, the last thing on the list is harsh punishment. And so our work is really about figuring out how can we reduce that punishment paradigm and increase the way in which folks have an opportunity to heal and have some kind of reconciliation after violence, and ultimately preventing violence at the front end. And the other piece of our work is this idea of building community power, building community safety. And so my work in this piece of this is around the policy side. And so our work is really designed to figure out how do we open policy space at the state level that allows communities to be centered and be able to talk about what they need to be safe. And so that looks like creating state grant programs so that communities can draw down state funds to actually fund frontline safety work. One example, in California, we just passed a piece of legislation that taxes firearms and ammunition at a very small level, and that money will go very specifically to reducing gun violence in our communities, also in our schools, and move towards some safe storage and around firearms. So really, I think our work fits in two pieces, like reducing the harm of the system and then also building up our community capacity and our power to take the reins of their own safety needs.
Hey everybody. Okay. Some things I think you all should know about me. I am a person who uses drugs. I am a violent offender, but you didn't know that. And I'm a Jew that supports Palestine. I think, so my background is public health, and public health is like everything. Like everything you can think of in the world contributes to our health. And I think the way that we're defining safety is very similar. Like safety is everything. I know we're talking a lot about the criminal punishment system, but it's also like clean drinking water. That's safety. Like fire response systems that work, having fences around pools, like that's all safety. But I think that this idea of safety that is used in rhetoric that harms other people, it's all about safety from other people, right? It's not safety to be able to take care of ourselves and each other. It's safety from a person doing a thing to you. So yeah, I think that I'm really glad that we're discussing safety and that we can rethink safety together. So the work that Sonoran Prevention Works does is we support people who use drugs and people who've been impacted by drug policy. And we operate from a harm reduction framework. And in harm reduction, it's usually applied to drug use, but it can really be applied to anything. But it's this concept that we accept reality, right? The reality is that people use drugs, whether we like it or not. And so what can we do to reduce some of the harms so that people who are using drugs aren't dying needlessly? We can give out naloxone so that if somebody does experience an overdose, it's not fatal. We can give people syringes so that we're reducing the transmission of HIV and hepatitis C. We can create housing systems that keep people housed even though they're smoking meth, right? And harm reduction comes from the Black Panthers and it comes from the Young Lords. And those groups were like creating safety for themselves because systems were failing them, right? Nobody else was keeping them safe. Everybody else was challenging their safety and making them unsafe. And so they created a lot of programs for themselves to be safe. And that's where harm reduction comes from. Later on it was feminists fighting for reproductive rights. It was the ACT UP movement in the 80s and 90s. To protect people who were dying of AIDS-related complications. So that really is the history of harm reduction. It's not just this like public health thing that like health departments do. We believe that everybody has like freedom to choose what to do with their bodies, and that's safety, right? That people should have freedom from shame and from stigma. That's safety. And drug policy matters for all of us because everybody uses drugs. But there's a couple of you in here who use drugs that are not legal, right? And probably more of you who love people who use drugs that are not legal. Overdose affects everybody. Incarceration for drug-related crimes affects everybody. And I think that drug policy is one of the ways that our movements weave together because this is the weapon that's used against so many of us. And so at Sonoran Prevention Works, many of us have lived and living experience with drug use. We work from the micro to the macro. We work all over the state of Arizona. We operate syringe service programs where we're giving out supplies to reduce transmission of HIV and AIDS, and also just so people can be safe, so they're not burning their lips on somebody else's meth pipe. We give out naloxone, we give out fentanyl test strips, and this wasn't all legal. Not that long ago, it was a felony to do this. Were we still doing it? Absolutely, because that's safety for our communities. So we are working to change material conditions for those that we can reach, while also at the institutional and policy level trying to change outcomes for everybody, so that it doesn't just have to be us doing needle exchange, right? So that all of the institutions and all of the settings that interact with people who use drugs can do a better job. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I am so excited to be up here on this panel with you guys, and I think that it is a really kind of segues into what community justice does. Community justice is one of the only, I believe, survivor-led by people of color gun violence prevention organization. And I take that to heart. So with my background, growing up a Latina in Texas, had its perks, and then it had very difficult things as well. You know, there was growing up in the 80s, you kind of had to assimilate because there was still the remnants of what was left of the civil rights movement. And so there was still a lot of stigma of being a Spanish-speaking Mexican in Texas. And so unfortunately, my generation, a lot of my generation, didn't learn Spanish because we needed to fit in. We needed to be American, with quotes. And so looking back on that, I feel, you know, not necessarily ashamed, but I'm sad that I was not afforded that opportunity to really thrive in my culture. And throughout my lifetime, I've experienced gun violence in multiple capacities. I've lost friends to gun violence. My first bite, that was by domestic violence by a gun. My first experience was in the 5th grade, and we lived on the northwest side of Houston. And I had a friend who was shot and survived in a drive-by shooting that was intended for his brother. Moving forward, you know, I look back and there were multiple times that I had experienced gun violence. And I never realized until now how much that changed me each and every time I experienced it in every single capacity. From the friends that I had to help leave relationships, including my own sister, who was threatened with a gun, to, you know, friends that committed suicide, to seeing someone be shot in a parking lot in Houston. Seeing Columbine when I was in high school and thinking there's no way this could be real. Seeing Parkland happen and having conversations with my own children about what to do if there's an active shooter in your classroom. Even just that conversation created a bit of a shift in my children. Then getting the phone call that there was a rumor of an active shooter. Then walking out my front door and seeing every emergency vehicle south of where I was on Highway 6, racing down the street. Trying to feel like it's normal, like it's just a drill, just another drill, to take my youngest to school. Then to receive the phone call that no, it's real. Then to receive the text because my daughter is scared because she's at a neighboring campus and they're going on lockdown because there's an alleged shooter going there. Getting the I love you text. Wondering if I'm gonna see her again. Then having to be outside of the high school to see children that I see on the football field, that I see at the grocery store, that I see at the county fair, that play with my children, that know my children. To see some of them bleeding, crying, my friends looking for their children and then finding out that they're gone. And then having to answer to your child that it could have been them. Having them tell you that you lied to them because you said it would never happen here. Then to see Uvalde, to have to see another set of parents experience the grief and the anguish that people I know and love experienced. There's a shift that happens in each and every one of us in all our capacities. We all become survivors. It changes us. You're never the same after that. Even those individuals who watched it on TV have a little bit of a shift. And one of the things that community justice does is we empower those survivors and empower those communities that have been affected. Because the victims are not always just the person who's been shot. Each and every one of those who was in that close contact, that was in that school, that heard those screams, that stepped over that blood. And I hate to get graphic, but at this point we have to. How about the children that had to cover themselves in their friend's blood in Uvalde? 10-year-olds who survived but are still victims. Their siblings that had to go to the hospital, who have to watch them go through their grief, watch them go through their trauma, their traumatic night terrors. This is also something that we need to realize about even those folks in some of these communities that are experiencing this every single day. That it becomes not that they're acting in a criminal manner, but that a lot of this is that grief from them themselves being a victim of losing a loved one. And so one of the things, another thing that community justice does is creates coalitions within these spaces, working with organizations such as these, such as Just Communities, to be able to provide the resources to these communities that are in need. Going back to what I shared in my bio, the disparities were so blatant. There was a response in 3 hours, maybe less. Uvalde and Santa Fe are very similar distances to Austin, Texas, our state capital. So we had lawmakers there immediately. We had a resiliency center set up. We had, there were so many different things that were given to Santa Fe. They released restrictions to be able to get resources to the family, monetary resources to the families. We had very quick changes to our schools. All of our vestibules in each and every one of our campuses were adjusted to be able to create more security. We had our lieutenant governor donate metal detectors to each and every one of our schools. But in Uvalde, they had police officers assaulting parents who were just simply looking for their children, wanting some kind of information, confirmation that their babies were okay, were alive. We didn't have that in Santa Fe, but you had a ton of that in Uvalde. It took 24 hours for leadership to make it to Uvalde, Texas, to address that community and to acknowledge the loss, the massive loss that was had. Something that could have been prevented. They had 4 years to prevent that from happening. It should have been a lesson learned. And it, to me, and to my family, and even to my oldest daughter, it was clear. And London said it best. Those kids look like Alex's mom. These are the things that we need to have leadership recognize. That we have to address this public health crisis in a public health manner. We have to be able to treat each and every one of those people with dignity and provide the necessary resources for them to be able to move through this trauma. Because when we don't, we know that people that experience gun violence are likely within the first year to 5 years to then engage in gun violence in some capacity, whether it be suicide, whether it be domestic violence, or whether it's a moment of passion and retaliation and anger because there's no treatment. And so with the coalition building, we really focus on bringing those survivors in to help them realize the power that they truly have to be able to make some of those legislative changes, to make sure that they have the ability to help someone else to work through that trauma and grief, and to try to prevent these things from happening again. And without those coalitions, that political power, that human peace, we aren't able to move through this. And we aren't able to make change. So that's a little bit about community justice, and I'm sure later on, again, like everybody is discussing up here, I don't want to take too much of that time, but there are other things that, we'll bring up about the coalition building.
Thank you all so much. So I just want to pick up on a theme that, I've heard from each one of you. And, we've spoken about this before, that traditionally this model of public safety has concentrated responsibility, decision-making power, resources within government institutions, police, fire, prosecutors. But what I'm hearing, and I think Mona, you really spoke to the need for just relationship, fundamental relationships and belonging, but also these multiple roles of community in creating safety for ourselves, right? Particularly in communities for whom the state has never produced safety, and in many cases is producing the opposite of safety, right? In communities of color. So could you all talk a little bit more about how you see the role of community in creating safety? What does that look like in practice? And how is that different when communities are given that agency from that institution?
I think there's a lot to look at already. As you talked about, so much of the models of safety come from cultural practices, whether it's Black Panther, indigenous practices, and I think all we have to do in some ways is look to what our communities have been doing for decades and for centuries, and be able to find the space in our communities to let those solutions thrive. And I think part of the policy work is about, how do we get the state out in some ways and create the space? The state has money, and it has buildings, and it has vehicle, it has a lot of things. So if we can create the space and drive some resources into our communities who are actually, doing that work, I think that is one way in which we'll start to make those ties inside communities. And I think there was a few years ago an organization called LEAP. I can never remember the acronym. Law Enforcement Action Partnership.
Yes.
They did a report. I think it was in 2020, and they looked at 15 cities around the country, and they pulled all the 911 logs to see what police were being called for. And one of the things they found is that something like 85% of the calls that police are asked to be called for are things that police aren't actually trained for. Things like mental health emergencies and all kinds of things. And yet the police are showing up to these situations that they are not trained for. And in some cases, those situations escalate. There are many examples of people in the midst of mental health crises who are then killed by police because our police don't have the capacity to do that. And so I think I move moved quite a bit off of your question, but I think
It's all related.
as we get the state out and as we remove the police from responding to every need in our community, we start allowing our communities to respond to each other. And I think that is also a way in which we build connection to each other. Sociologists talk about strong ties and weak ties, and in our communities, we've seen a destruction of like weak tie connections, which is when we know each other, right? I see you in my neighborhood, I know you're here, and and that is one way in which we build community. But those weak ties have fallen so much, and some of it is an impact of the pandemic, some of it is impact of all kinds of things, but part of that work is to allow community to respond so that we can increase the ways in which we can be connected to each other. But I guess for me, the top one is like get the state out of the business of safety and responding to all of these things.
We're in a very interesting social climate right now. And I know, speaking specifically for Texas, but the rhetoric, guys, is like real right now. And even more so, especially in Texas. Of course, we're a border state. We have a very, very high population of Black and brown folks in Texas. We are now the majority, believe it or not. But unfortunately, with a lot of this rhetoric and implicit bias, right, with Mexicans being rapists and Mexicans being criminals, you've got these, a lot of times there's this notion that, and I hear it all the time, that, well, that's just a poor community. It's what they deal with when we're talking about everyday gun violence. And unfortunately, when you put those institutional practices into these communities that have already had the police brutality, that have already had, just like you were talking about, with these folks that don't have the resources to seek out mental health support, who don't have health care to be able to get the medications or, go to a chiropractor or a therapist. And then even with the domestic violence, especially in our Black communities, as soon as there is a police officer, immediately, because of what's happening in our country, that tension and that anxiety builds up. And likely most of the time, they're not reacting from their own reality, they're reacting out of fear and survival. And we end up having these issues where we've got people who are being gunned down or killed by police. And it creates difficult circumstances to try to diffuse situations that with policing that should be done with community. You can't prosecute your way out of this issue. And we have to be able to make those connections with those individuals and with that community. And that's where a lot of the restorative justice comes in. And like, for instance, in Austin, in Travis County, there is a wonderful organization that is now a part of ATX Peace, which is the Austin Office of Violence Prevention, which is Jail to Jobs. And these are folks who have been incarcerated for violent offenses, for misdemeanor offenses, who have served years and years for murder, that have the ability to make those connections and understand what it is that these communities truly need, what these individuals are in need of, and the resources. They have the ability to make
those connections because they acknowledge that individual as a human being likely acting out of trauma, acting out of PTSD, acting out of survival, things that other folks who are not from that community have no concept of what that is. And so you cannot fix a community issue without the community that knows it best. And that, I think, is why we need to have the partnerships with these community violence intervention programs, with these organizations that have the credible messengers that are from the community, know the community, and can speak on what happens after you take that step to act in violence, or to beat your wife, or to take your own life, or to take that of someone else's.
Wow, those were great. I don't have like a whole lot more to add, except that it really is communities that create safety. It is not governments. It's not nonprofits. Like I can tell you as somebody who started and is running a nonprofit, it's not nonprofits that are going to create safety for us, right? We can facilitate some pieces of it, but like it is community. And I think what's really important is that it's those you're in community with in like a close geographic proximity, right? If shit is hitting the fan in my house and I have to leave my house, I'm freaking out on my front porch. It's not the person I share an identity with who might be 10 miles away from me. It's my neighbor who I need, right? And if I don't know my neighbor's name, if they don't know my name, like that is safety, right? If we see people in our neighborhoods who are experiencing crisis, like it is our responsibility as members of that neighborhood and of that community to stop and ask them if they're okay and ask them if they need anything. I know it's not always possible to do that for every single person, right? But I think that's what we forget about a lot. I think we think a lot about community as those we share identities with. And that's important too. Like that's really important. But I do want us, and me myself, like want to focus more on creating that community with people who I'm physically close to. Part of the question is, what does this look like in practice? Like it actually takes a lot of intimacy and a lot of vulnerability. Like a lot, if your neighbor is playing music really loud at 2 a.m, like it's uncomfortable to go over there in your fucking slippers and say, hey, I know you guys are having a really good time, but I'm tired. Like that sucks. That sucks to have to be that person. And it's so much easier to just call 911, right? Like nobody has to know that you made the complaint. You don't have to deal with it. It's their problem. It's not yours. An example that recently came up of this is in my neighborhood. We have lots and lots of dogs, and some dogs aren't taken care of very well, and there's lots of reasons for that. My partner noticed a dog that was like injured in the front yard and like didn't look like they were doing very well. So it'd be so much easier to just call the dog police, be like, hey, this person at this address isn't treating their dog right. But like instead, my partner hopped their fence and knocked on their door and said, hey, I see your dog is injured. Is there anything I can do to help? Right? Like that's hard to do. We don't do that. Like we don't do that as people. But that's actually what it's going to take if we're serious about getting these institutions away from us and creating our own safety. Like it's not fun. You have to have a lot of uncomfortable conversations. And I think that as we've gotten so much more, social media, whatever has happened in the last 15 years, like we're so much more uncomfortable talking to each other. And so we have to like regrow those muscles.
Yeah, I think that's it.
I'd love to be able to just piggyback on that a second, because we did a whole research project in Tucson, Arizona, and we asked 1,200 people about their quality of life issues and what safety means to them and what kinds of resources they'd like to see in their neighborhoods. And like, you know, if we had done this survey, probably, like, I've been doing this a long time, y'all. If we had done this, 20, 30 years ago, it would have been like crime, immigration, rah. No, what people were like, holy shit, housing. Oh my God, housing. Top of the chart. Number 2 concern, what are you most concerned about in your community? Inequality.
Mhm.
Tucsonans are concerned about inequality, which means A, they recognize that there is some, and B, they want to do something about it. But when we ask people, what is it that you want to feel safe? They said, I want to know my neighbors, right? So yeah, it's uncomfortable, but I think people really are looking for that, and it is hard to do. And it's hard to do because of the dynamic, Haley, that you mentioned earlier, which is that our whole concept of safety is safety from. That other people are what's making you unsafe. When in fact, other people are what makes us safe. If you have those relationships with your neighbors, you are exponentially more safe. And you're going to feel more safe because you know who the hell they are. It's the not knowing, right, that makes everybody sus. Everybody looks like, I don't know, a little sketchy. Who is that? What are they doing there? Right? Because you just straight don't know.
I think also on top of this idea of the punishment paradigm and like bad people will do bad things and we'll put them away, it already sets up this idea that, maybe the people around you are already bad.
Right?
And the punishment paradigm almost like sets us aside from each other.
Yes.
Haley, I think you're totally right on in that, not only are people what makes us safe, but like it is hard to do that work. Individually walk up to you and say, this thing that you're doing is hard for me and I'm just your neighbor. But I think, as you mentioned, people are really, I think, desperate for connections. And we've just been talking, many of you have probably gone to conferences in the last several months. We've been to several conferences, and the thing that we found is people are going to conferences, but they are not going to sessions. They are going to talk to each other in the halls. People want to
Didn't we always do that at
connect.
conferences?
People want to connect, and I think there's something here for us, especially in our communities. How do we facilitate those connections to each other and move that conversation on? But that's a one-to-one, and I do think there are some safety strategies that are happening in our communities that are doing that, right? There are street teams that are around the country, and the whole purpose of a street team is to be out in community and know who people are and make sure people know each other. Folks are out walking the street. I'm out. I know you, Miss Sharon, because I see you every day. She knows who I am, and that kind of frontline safety work are the kinds of things that, one, it allows us to bring credible messengers into the space, but it also, one of the most important things that those street teams do is to build those connections in our community.
Can you say a little bit more about how does that work? Like, what do the street teams look like? What's their purpose?
So the purpose of street teams is really to be out in a community, and it depending on where they are, it usually depends on, they are often community built. And so the purpose of the street team is to be around if something happens in the neighborhood, to be able to, one, be on the scene and do any work to identify what are the needs of the folks who are involved in this conflict. Whether it's, if someone has been killed, what does a family need, what do friends need, and then also being able to pay attention to what did this do inside the community? Are we scared about further violence because of this? In street teams, there are folks who are from the community. In some cases, there are folks who have caused harm and are now coming back and want to actually do something different. In some cases, they're still connected to things that are happening. So it's both like a relationship and a peacemaking group that is there. And I think the other thing, while I think street teams have been developed and designed to identify and do work after harm has happened. I think one of the things that we have seen, especially with street teams like New York Community Street Team, their work has really started to expand to some of that front of the violence prevention side, doing a lot of harm reduction and really, folks on the street learning about harm reduction. Street teams carry naloxone. They know what the signs of addiction look like. They know how to administer that. They train other community members how to do that, and have their eyes and ears. I think another thing that's really important about street teams is while they are often on the scenes with police, they aren't the police. They do not share information. They do not work with the police, and they are there to be a resource for community, not a resource for the police. And so it looks different in every community, but that's generally, what street teams are there to do.
So another kind of thread throughout this conversation and some of the other dialogues that we've had is this dynamic, because I think the way that we've structured our notions of safety around bad guys, we also have constructed a notion of victims and who victims are and what victims look like. And you spoke really eloquently to this, Christina, right? The victims are white ladies in this conception, right? But we know statistically that the people who are most likely to experience violence in their lives are people of color, young men of color in particular, right? But that construct does not somehow apply. So I'm curious, each of you are dealing with folks who are experiencing harm, who in some cases have themselves caused harm, and also the fact that victims, offenders are somehow not the same people or in the same families is also a real ridiculous fantasy. Everyone sitting in prison right now, everyone sitting in jail has been victimized. Right? So this false dichotomy, I think, is also one that's really not useful. But how do you work to shift this conversation in a way that provides meaningful support and assistance for survivors, however you encounter them? And what do, and Mona, you spoke to this a little bit, what do the people you work with tell you that they need to be safe, and what does safety look like to them? That was a lot. Sorry.
I'm so glad you talked about white women.
Let's talk about white women, y'all.
Let's talk about white women.
We gotta talk about
Every American drug policy that's been introduced has been under the guise of protecting white women. So the first American drug policy was actually in San Francisco in the 1800s. And it was to outlaw the smoking of opium, not opium itself, but the smoking of opium, which the folks who were smoking opium at that point were Chinese immigrants. And the way that this story was told was white women are being seduced into these opium lounges by Chinese men, right? In the 30s and 40s, when cannabis was legalized, it was because of Mexican immigrants with their marijuana making white women do ungodly things, right? We've got the crackdown on crack in the 80s, which very obvious, it completely animalized Black men because they were going to be hurting white women, right? And segregation was upheld by this idea that if we integrate, Black men are going to be raping and murdering white women, right? So white women, it's important that we be shifting this narrative, right? I don't feel safe when drugs are criminalized. I don't feel safe when my neighbors have their doors busted in and are arrested. That makes me feel unsafe. So I think that's what has always driven drug policy. It's not about overdose. Nobody gives a fuck about overdose, right? only until policymakers' kids started dying of overdose did they realize, ooh, our policies are actually hurting our kids, right? But it was never about that. It was never about health or safety when all of these drug policies have been enacted and upheld. And I think, it can also be tempting to like minimize survivors' experiences when we hear the rhetoric that's like hurting the people we love who might be considered to be like the offenders. So I think that there's a balance there of being able to like honor what survivors have experienced. Whether they're white women who are like scared of the black man on the corner looking at them, or like, people who have experienced some real ass fucking violence, by the state, by whoever. The people that we work with, a lot of the people that we see are unhoused. Not everybody, but a lot of people. And housing is the number one thing, right? We see people who are using drugs that they may not otherwise use because they need to stay awake at night, so that they're not beat up, right? We see people who are staying in really violent, awful situations because they can't get their own independent housing. So housing is always a huge one. And I think that a lot of the people that we work with don't see themselves as survivors, no matter what they've been through, because they've been told over and over that they are offenders, and that they are criminals and that they are felons and that they're dangerous. When just as you said in the question, like they have experienced so much violence, so much institutional, so much interpersonal violence. So yeah, I think this narrative around being a survivor is something that I want to think more about. And like everybody has the ability to be a survivor and a perpetrator. I think a lot about like cancel culture. And cancel culture required, in order for us to move past that, it requires what I was talking about earlier, like we have to be okay with being uncomfortable and talking to people who have caused harm. Not everybody can speak directly to the person who's perpetrated that harm. That's okay. But like every person who has perpetrated harm, whether it's like real or not, is part of a community, and it's that community's job to like work with them and to help them heal and to help them move through whatever it is that's happened. That's it.
I think about, I love that you keep bringing up about being vulnerable, because everybody has experienced things in our lives. And each and every one of those experiences has brought us to this moment and who we are right now. And I think about so many of the experiences that I have had, violence that I have experienced, violence against my children that I have experienced, that they have experienced. And something that I always go back to, especially when we're talking about acts of violence that are happening every day that don't make the news, that are not talked about, that are not acknowledged. Having to have someone violate your life in any capacity, whether it be by an assault, whether it be your security, your safety. When it happens to you, your immediate go-to is you want them to pay. You want them to know the pain that you felt in those moments where you were violated. And for me, when I see some of these folks engaging in acts of violence, to me, I wonder what happened to them. What pain is it that they have that no one acknowledged that caused them to move to this moment? And we're seeing a lot more of that happening In Galveston County, where I live, it's south of Houston proper. We have had a major increase in everyday shootings in our community. And a neighboring community to Santa Fe is Lamarck and Hitchcock, which are primarily a Black community. And we're losing these Black and brown boys weekly. My friend Rosie, I'll give you guys an example. My friend Rosie lost her son in our shooting. Chris was 17. He had just gone to prom, played football with the shooter in our case. And Chris fought with the shooter to keep the door shut. And the shooter took a step back and shot Chris through the door. One single pellet of birdshot hit him in just the right spot in his temple and killed him. He, however, saved 7 lives that day. And for whatever reason, Texas withheld information from these families. They didn't get to hear any of the autopsy results or anything like that. We had to fight for 4 years just to get a bill passed for them to have autopsy results to let them know how their children died. So for 4.5 years, almost 5 years, Rosie had to sit and wonder. Recently, how Chris died, how it went down. Did he suffer? Did he cry for her? How long did it take? Etc. So last weekend, we celebrated her daughter's wedding. It was a beautiful ceremony. We celebrated Chris's life. We know that he was looking down on us, and Mercedes, Chris's sister, wanted one of the centerpieces to be dropped off at the crosses. We've got a little memorial. So Rosie and I did that, and she loves sweet tea, and it was a very emotional day, and it was a great day. So, and of course it's midnight, and everything closes at 9 o'clock in a small country town, y'all. Everything. So we decided to go to the Whataburger in Lamarck, and which is just down the street from the crosses. So as we're pulling up, we see that there are fire trucks and there's a bunch of emergency vehicles, and I just figured it caught on fire or something because all we saw were fire trucks. So we decided we were just going to get tea and snacks at the corner store. When we pull in, we see the crime scene tape. We see people being spoken with from law enforcement. And we figured, okay, it might have just been like a robbery or something. We were going to go and get our stuff. When we got out of the car, they told us that the corner store was closed because there had been a shooting, and the two that did the shooting ran into the corner store, hid in a bathroom, and then they were picked up. And the lady who was explaining it to us said that there were 2 boys who were 18 and 17, I believe, were shot, and one didn't make it. And it was one of those moments where everything is moving in real time, but everything is also moving very slowly. And right as she said that, I saw the young man who didn't make it under a sheet, and I could not move quick enough to stop Rosie from looking. And in that moment, she screamed, "Oh my God," turned white, and she immediately thought of Chris. Is that what he looked like? Is this what happened? All of those years of recovery that she went through brought her right back to that moment. And once she came to, the emotion came, the anger came, the thinking about, the shooter that is mentally incompetent at this point, who's never going to be tried. The parent who negligently left all their firearms unsecured to allow this 17-year-old who allegedly was troubled, and I don't think that he was not. He likely was. And there's a lack of resources in that community. All of these things brought her through all of these different emotions. And Rosie is one of my friends that we had to make sure every morning that we checked on her. Because of the trauma, there were times where we didn't know if she was still going to be there. We didn't know if she was going to take her own life. We've recently had another shooting in a very close vicinity. Actually last week, just days after the shooting that we saw on Lamarck. Likely, we're thinking this is a retaliation. Because now someone else has been affected. Someone else has been given trauma. It's being passed on. But the connections that we make, those of us who have experienced trauma and learned how to move through it, we are able to create that support system. We are able to diffuse these situations that could turn violent, whether self-inflicted or interpersonal. We can diffuse those situations where someone might turn to going and getting drunk and going home and beating their wife or their children or harming themselves. And so it's important for us to allow ourselves to be vulnerable with those who have had similar experiences so that we can create that sense of community and create that safety to be able to prevent these things from happening.
Yeah, I wonder, it makes me think about the groups of survivors, the parents that, and I get to hang out with Christina a little bit, so it's awesome. I get to hear these stories about how they'll go to the Capitol and just scare the crap out of all the legislators. Like the scary moms are here, the angry moms are here. And I wonder, having worked myself for a long time with individuals who have criminal convictions, who've been incarcerated, and wanting to use their voices to speak out against drug policies, against criminal justice policies that are harming themselves and their communities. And it's this real tricky balance, right? Of, it's hella effective, right? Because I myself have tried to have a lot of conversations with elected officials, and you can have all the facts and research and everything in the world, and they just really don't care. And they'll argue with you. They'll say, well, I have my own facts and statistics that I pull out of the air, but no one can argue with what you yourself have experienced. No one can tell you that didn't happen to you and you don't feel that way. So it's very effective, but it's kind of this double-edged sword for folks where in one way it's therapeutic, right? It's like group therapy, right? Like we're all in this together. We have this common experience and we are finding our power. We're finding our voice. We're going and we're going to make change and make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. And it's also constantly having to go and just like rip open your wound in front of crowds of people and legislators and indifferent staffers and be vulnerable in that way. And that's a lot to ask. So I don't know if, and you all too, like in terms of the folks that you've worked with, you've done policy work, you do policy work, right? Is that, how do we find that balance for folks, or how do they find it for themselves?
I think as advocates, consent is really important, and it's, I think, critical as we move into the policy space with folks to be very clear about what might happen. I mean, we've all probably been in rooms with policymakers where they've been complete dicks to people who have experienced harm, pardon my French. But it's so important for us to be as transparent as possible with what might possibly happen, and then to ask questions about what folks need during and after they're telling their story. And if it's to get out right away, tell your story and get out, great. And I think as advocates, it's our job to make sure that folks who are telling their story, that we know what they need. And there was an opportunity for folks to opt out even like 1 second before they're about to talk, because it's just incredibly traumatic to do that work. And so I think we need to be as open as possible to what people need, and to be, I think, as creative as possible to find scenarios where people can be as comfortable as they are able to be, to talk about, sometimes some of the most hard days of their lives. But I think we also, folks who have been harmed by violence, folks who have committed violence, there's so much similarity in terms of what people need to heal from both causing harm and or being harmed. And so there's, I think, a really rich space for vulnerability together inside of that Venn diagram as well.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is to be rooted in reality, right? We have these big things that really aren't as big as people make them out to be, meaning the lawmakers. And I totally have been in those situations because my senator is Ted Cruz.
Oh, they think their britches are so big. Right?
I have to deal with him quite often. I have worked with Senator Cornyn's office. We actually did a lot of work with the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which was really, really great. But yes, my senator is Ted Cruz, so I've had lots of those experiences. But one of the things that we have to be is rooted in reality, and that is a conversation that us Santa Fe families, which there's only 4 of us, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, 3 gun owners, 1 veteran, but we all have our common goal that we want, and that's change, and that's to prevent another family from having to go through the same pain in all the capacities that we did. My friend Rosie lost her son, my friend Rhonda lost her daughter, my friend Scott nearly lost his wife Flo, who was our substitute teacher that actually pushed my daughter's friend out the door and nearly lost her life doing so. And then myself experiencing, the shooting in the capacity that I did, having friends' children in that school make it out and some not. One thing that we wanted to do with the Uvalde families was share what we had learned in moving through the legislative processes, both at the federal level and at the state level, and even going down to county levels and local municipalities as well. And it was very important for us to do that, because the reason I brought up Ted Cruz, 2 things. Right after our shooting was the Senate election, which was Beto against Ted Cruz. So Beto had linked up with Rhonda, and they've become very good friends. We've all become friends with Beto. He's just an amazing human. Who truly does it out of sincerity and love for people and love for the state of Texas. Ted Cruz had my friend Rosie, which is interesting because now we're all in this group together doing this work, and kind of brought her along, made promises to her, made promises to our community. And then as soon as he got elected, all of a sudden, it's like he changed his number. Nobody can get a hold of him. Nobody can ask questions. Emails aren't being answered. So 4 years later, we go back, and Rosie is having to relive the worst moment of her life that she in her own privacy relives, which is very different when you have to relive it in front of other people, especially someone who has the power to help make change in honor of her dead kid. At that point, he was so dismissive. We were talking about a safe storage law called Ethan's Law that they're trying to pass at the federal level, from my good friend Kristen Song, who lost her son also to a unsecure firearm. And I guess he forgot that Rosie is, I mean, we're gun-toting Latinas in Texas. And, but we don't have to wave them around so everybody can see it. Just FYI, just so we're clear. We're not all that way. And he was so dismissive to her and so rude. Now, Rosie, again, being the crazy Latina that she is, had to call him out on it. And called him out on the fact that he didn't even know the bill, anything in the bill. Didn't read it, asked a staffer. She said, I didn't ask him, I asked you. Where it says that a responsible gun owner is going to be affected by a law that they don't break because they practice safe storage. Unfortunately, right after we had gotten back is when Uvalde happened. The Rubio family were there to talk about an assault weapons ban because it was an assault weapon that took the life of their child. A weapon that doesn't need to be in the hands of everybody. Does not need to be in the hands of everybody. And I say that with my own personal experience of shooting one. It is a very lethal and dangerous weapon. And in some cases, can be useful, like on a battlefield, not in an elementary school. And one thing that we wish that we would have been able to do was have more conversations with the Uvalde families to prepare them for what they were going to experience when showing a picture of their daughter in a coffin to Ted Cruz. And to have him dismiss them. Your dead child, in a coffin. And he was so rude to them. And it annihilated them. And so when we went through our Texas legislature this session, I had just started with community justice. So I've only been with CJF for a year now, but it is my passion, my heart and soul to be able to be this voice when these survivors need to rest. Because I know in a capacity what they're going through. Not necessarily in the same form that they have with the trauma that they've experienced with their children, but in my own capacity. And when they need to rest, this conversation still needs to happen. When these survivors, when these families who are grieving have to take a step back, we can't stop. And so it was important for us to have those very brutal conversations about these wants that we have and what it means truly to have a win. Doesn't mean it has to make it all the way across the finish line. But if you can etch a crack in that system and in that barrier that has been put up in all of these systems throughout our country, you are winning. And we had the ability, we made sure that in those days where we were lobbying, we had safe spaces for our survivors. We had folks, our Santa Fe families, each had a buddy with some of these families to be able to recognize when that trauma is coming, recognize when that anxiety is about to hit, and be able to very quickly get them away. It allowed them to breathe and then continue that work. And so those things allowed us to get a bill, which I'm very proud of, further than it was ever intended to go. In fact, the author of the bill told us that raise the age was never going to make it off print on paper. We got it assigned to a committee, we got it heard in a committee, and we got it voted out of the committee with 2 Republican votes to move it through. Now, by the time we were out of time because it was the end of session, but regardless, we broke barriers because we were honest, we were vulnerable, we built that relationship, and we supported each other. And so it's important to be able to take care of them because it was their voices, their experience and then backing them into a corner and forcing them to acknowledge that this occurred is what made it across the finish line.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Well, I have a whole bunch of, I think, really great questions, but we have reached that point in the night where we want to hear from you. So like I said, it's a small group. We can dispense with the little note cards and stuff. Just raise your hand, shout it out. What do you got? Don't be shy. We're being vulnerable. We're creating relationships. We're having hard conversations. Yes.
I was just wondering, you guys were talking about like better gun safety with like securing them better. And I saw something recently that mentioned gun education as well. So where does that play in with better like locking it up, especially with the case of the children and minors who take advantage of unsecured guns?
Well, sometimes, as a parent with one child still left in public school system, the others are grown, sometimes people need to be reminded of the responsibility that they have. And so it's really us doing our part to hold those folks accountable. We hold each other accountable when we're talking about gun safety. And now with the experience that we've had, we hold our neighbors responsible. It's a question that we ask when our kids go to somebody else's house. It's like, oh, what kind of gun safe do you have? How do you secure your weapon? Where is it at? I ask those questions because I know what the repercussions are when it's not secure. Not just with our shooting, but in multiple other aspects of my life and experiences that I've had. And so it is important to have that education out. It's important for us as communities to put that out there. And it allows us to initiate those uncomfortable conversations as well. So I feel that it is a very important factor. And I know that multiple coalitions, including our Texas Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence, which consists of 70 plus organizations that come together, to work on different initiatives throughout the state, that this is an important piece and a very, very large step forward in creating safety in our communities.
It's interesting. So I grew up in rural Pennsylvania. A lot of people hunt, and my dad would won like marksmanship competitions and stuff like that. And he was a gun safety instructor for the NRA. Like that was a role that he played, and that was a thing that the NRA was about back in the day, right? That was a huge role that organization played, was primarily around just basic information about gun safety. And it's very interesting. And over his lifetime, businessman, Republican guy from Northeast Pennsylvania, where he felt that organization had strayed off course. But it's a great question. What else you got? Come on, NAU.
Well, I have a comment, not really a question. It's a line from one of my favorite rappers. And it goes a little like this. It says, get comfortable with being uncomfortable. You're being stretched.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to say that because it sounds like that's the theme we all have to kind of get in our heads, is we have to be uncomfortable sometimes to get to change. And it's okay.
People are messy.
And it's okay to make policymakers uncomfortable for that change, right? I think that's
Absolutely.
that's part of moving that forward, right? We should be uncomfortable with each other, but but our policymakers who aren't actually taking votes they should take or taking votes at all should feel uncomfortable with those decisions. If they're going to vote against safety, it should feel bad for them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I like that quote very much. Very, very much.
Gary, hello.
I would just add to the conversation that I agree with your assessment of community. And attorney here in our Flagstaff, the defender's office, author that does civil rights litigation. I can tell you I can do all the litigation in the world. It's not going to change. It's cynical. It's us against them. But some studies too, to the and police use and racial bias among Flagstaff Police Department. And I think the answer in terms of what should be done is the community has to make mistakes. And I partially hold the community at fault. Some of you have said it in terms of the tools that the police have is one tool. That's basically the tool. But they're called to be involved in also social ills. But the community demands that somebody do something about it, and that's different to them. They're not the ones that do it. Their units, it needs to go further. But community organizations, the street teams, or those, I think, offer blueprint of hope, quite frankly, of the future of what wants. It's not going to come from legislators, initiated, or administrators.
I appreciate that. It's true, right? You can't legislate hearts and minds, and I think it is important for us to continue to move policy. But I think what you're also hitting at and what we've gotten at today is right. So the work of moving the community is also around organizing together and moving together. But I think I would add on to you as well is that what we haven't seen, I think, is resources available in the community to also take hold of those demands. It's one thing to advocate for that, but as we've seen both federal and state policy shift over the last 20 years, we've seen a decrease in resources available to our communities. And I think one of the reasons why we are sitting where we are now is the impact of policies that were put in place in the 80s and in the 90s and the early 2000s. So I think there's a role, both. I agree that there is a role that community has to have, and I also think that that our systems, our state has done a very good job of stripping the community of its own agency and its own resources to sort of take hold of that.
Yeah, I think even when we get policies passed, like the legislature undoes it.
Also that.
In Florida, 65% of voters thought that people with felonies should have their voting rights restored, and the legislature just dragged its feet and has tried to overturn it. A lot of times it just doesn't matter. We work so hard. I spent 10 years lobbying to get syringe service programs legalized.
And where are we now?
They're legalized, but people don't even use syringes anymore.
Right.
They use pipes, and that shit's illegal. So, I think that policy is useful in as much as when something gets passed, that means that there's probably a lot of community support for it, right? And there's probably a lot of community mobilization for it. But I think we also need to be brave. And the things that maybe aren't legal that should be legal, or that there's not funding for because the government has decided that it's not worthy enough to put resources towards it, that's where we have to step up. And it's hard to say because I actually personally really like lobbying. It's weird.
I feel you.
Yeah. And I'm showing my track marks to legislators. It's humiliating, but they listen to me after that. But not everybody can do that. It really sucks.
But I'm seeing more and more as time goes on that like so many of us are just like gonna waste a lot of time trying to get some words changed when like the government just goes and does whatever it wants anyways, like regardless of what the law says. So I do think that you know, for like to see sustainable change, we should do it ourselves.
The very brilliant Christy Donner, who's the head of Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition, she said this and it stuck with me. We make the mistake of thinking that the money follows the policy, but it's the other way around.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
You got to move the money.
That's right.
Start with moving the money, right? So like a lot of like the sentencing reforms that I spent 10 years working on, right, were about like, if we reduce the prison population, ergo, all this money will flow back into community. Not only did we not manage to pass the laws, but in those states that did their DOC budgets go down? No.
Right.
Not at all.
Yeah. I think the other piece of this is that passing the bill is only the first step, because there are so many policies that get passed into law that aren't actually implemented. And in some cases it's good because they're terrible. In some cases, double-edged sword, I can't hear, but I think part of, you know, on our end, on the advocates end, there is a lane for implementation, but I fully agree. Like the best policy happens because the work has already happened at the community level. And we know, right? Government is like 5-10 years behind what's actually happened. This syringe example is the perfect example, right? And so I agree. And like we have to lean in on implementation. Otherwise, like all of this time cannot and should not be wasted. But the implementation is like, that is just as gnarly as passing the bill.
Yeah, most definitely. You know, and the other piece to that too is, you know, with that's one of the main focuses for community justice and other organizations as well, is creating these community-based ecosystems where you've got these different organizations that are specializing in different types of resources and different kind of outreach to communities. Because, for instance, I'll give an example in Houston. You know, the Pasadena area, which is primarily Hispanic, has its own issues that need, you know, that niche type of response. Whereas if you go to Sunnyside on the north side of Houston, it's going to be a completely different type of response. But when you have these ecosystems and creating offices of violence prevention, you have the ability to have all of these community partners coming together, assessing what's happening in each of these communities that, you know, are within their jurisdictions or the community that they're coming from, to see where they need additional outreach. How much funding is it going to take to be able to expand on the services that they're giving to these communities? And advocacy isn't just simply in the policy aspect of it. It's also in the funding aspect of it. You know, with the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, there was millions upon millions of dollars that was allocated to community violence intervention programming, to states for safe storage, for all kinds of different things having to do with public health. But where is advocacy for that? Why is it not being allocated out to these states? Why is it not being allocated out to these jurisdictions? And that's because these communities, these organizations, don't have the ability or the know-how to possibly go after these grants. It's a long, grueling process to have to do. You know, finding out what are the requirements. You've got to get a grant writer. You've got to have, you know, people to back you up. In some cases, for depending on what the grant is, you've got to have the support of your own lawmaker. So in states like Texas or in states like Florida, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to do that because you have folks that have not yet been educated in what the needs are in those communities. And even, you know, being able to get those people in the local municipalities, your city council, your county members, your county elected officials, you know, you've got to have that education. You've got to have those systems to be able to rally together to help them realize what this need is. The other piece of that is the cost of gun violence to states is outrageous. Absolutely outrageous. When you're talking about hospitalization, you're talking about resources, you're talking about mental health, you're talking about incarceration. These things are costing the state millions upon millions of dollars. Whereas you could be investing that into communities and essentially saving that money. And that's speaking the language of these elected officials, because that's what they're wanting. You know, money talks in this game. But, you know, that's one of the things that is so important in that community building, in that public safety aspect, and in that coalition building, and creating those ecosystems so that this work is sustainable and we can truly take our communities back.
A quick one. Have you had any community conversations around safety or anything like that in your community? Have you had any conversations similar to this, or listening sessions, or anything like that around safety within your community, or has there been? Maybe not you're old enough, but has there been?
Yes, we've had, so we have done, we have something called Justice Camps. And we're revamping that for 2024. And so and this is happening throughout the nation. We have different regions that, you know, my colleagues work in: Northeast, Southeast, Midwest, and then on the Southwest. And so we do go into communities and talk to folks and ask them what it is that they need, connecting organizations within those local jurisdictions, and then coming together as a state to talk about the things that we need. And going back to the being vulnerable and having these uncomfortable conversations, I'm like the lone Democrat in like a totally red district. I love my neighbors. Sometimes I think that, you know, you have to kind of look at, in some cases, like we can disagree on like pineapple on pizza, but we can't disagree on like racism and like bigotry and, you know, denying people the ability to love who they love. But sometimes if, you know, I look at politics as like a pair of Crocs. I don't like them. I think they're hideous. No offense to anybody that wears them. But I have a pair of Crocs too, I'm not gonna lie. But they're the ones that look like tennis shoes. They look like tennis shoes. But I'm still gonna break bread with you. We're still gonna go have lunch, dinner, go to the winery, go to the movies. I'm just not gonna look at your feet. You know? But I have to have these conversations with my community. I don't care whether you're a Republican, an independent, you think you're a space alien, or you're looking for space lasers. I don't care. We're going to have these conversations because you are my neighbor and this is the community we both live in. And we know that one act that happened down the street affected each and every one of us, all 1,300 of us in Santa Fe. All the millions upon millions of people that live in the state of Texas and even beyond. So we're going to have the conversation. We might get mad at each other. We might start screaming, but it's going to be had, because without that, we're not going to be able to protect each other. We're not going to be able to have that community. So you have to insert yourself in those conversations. You have to have them. And you have to hold your neighbors accountable, you know, to ensuring that if I'm doing my part, you got to do yours too.
Other questions? Yeah, here in the front, and there saw a few more hands. Go ahead.
Sorry. Just to go back to the safety portion of it, one thing that I was thinking about through all the conversation is how, you know, internal work as far as what does safety look like for us? What does safety look like, not just internally for myself, but for my family, for my community? And how do we create that safety without causing harm to others? And I think that's something we failed as people for centuries, you know, being from an indigenous background. laws were created in benefit and to protect one part of that population and cause significant harms to ours and others, and that continues to happen. So I think, thinking about how hard it is to change legislation and do that work, how long it takes, is how do we do that within ourselves? Because I think that's where it really starts. It's questioning ourselves, going through that, and figuring out what does safety look like for us? How do we create that without causing harm? Because we often forget the second half of it. We're too busy trying to protect ourselves. And it trickles down into this cycle. And we can't change anything without, looking at the whole thing altogether, who we're affecting, what the choices we're making. How that will happen in legislation, I don't know. I don't mind. But I think internal work, that's all I was thinking through the conversation.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, that part of the question, how do we create safety without causing harm, I think is critically important, and one that we have to keep asking every single day. And I think, even lifting up from the internal piece, like those are questions we have to ask when we write policy. When folks who do policy, you probably heard the phrase unintended consequences, which is unacceptable when we do policy, right? And like we're not going to get it right all the time. Like, but we have to always ask the question, and we should, as advocates, be making sure that when we write those policies, we are, one, there's as many different people at the table as possible, and that we always ask that question. I don't think, it doesn't mean that we're always going to get it right, but I think policy, you're right, like policy hasn't been written in a way that question has been asked, and I think there's very much a willingness to accept the unintended consequences. And I think we can't continue to accept the unintended consequences, and we have to really affirmatively make sure and ask questions about who could be harmed by policies we're trying to move forward. But yes, all that to say, I agree.
Yeah. Christine, you're talking about some of the harm that's happened in Indigenous communities that, was in the name of protecting settlers or protecting Indigenous communities. And I read something recently about, it was about transformative justice. And they were saying, like, if we get rid of police, we can't let social workers become the next police, and it's the social workers who have caused so much harm, people who aren't using like physical violence, but people who are going in the name to help other people.
DSM.
The DSM. Oh my God. And Deanna, you asked the question about listening sessions, and I think about like even in our small little relationships and communities, like got a new roommate, ask them what safety means to them. You're engaging in a new relationship, ask them what safety means to them, so that we can like know on the front end where there might be some discrepancies. And I think like multiple truths can be possible at the same time. Like none of us share truths, and we all have different truths, and some of them oppose each other. It doesn't mean that one is untrue, right? Like we have these different experiences and these different values and these different things that are real for us. Where I might say, no, I'm helping, and that person says, no, you're hurting me, right? Like those can both be true. But I think that, in thinking about vulnerability and that self-work, like we just have to get really good at hearing when we've caused harm, because we all do it all the time. And like, I don't know, 90% of the time I cause harm, I'm not meaning to. Like sometimes I am, but most of the time I'm like really not meaning to. But that, intention versus impact, like doesn't really matter what was going through my head when I did or said this thing that really hurt somebody. And I think that fear prevents a lot of us from engaging at all. And like, I say some whack shit all the time. And like, I'm just really good at saying, when somebody gives me a look, or tells me like that was wrong, I'm like, oh man, like I was trying and I really messed up there. Like, that's how we do this, rather than just being afraid and not doing or not saying or not trying. And all the times that people have hurt me, like I've been able to deal with a whole lot of shit when people can say, oh my God, I didn't mean to, but I hear you that I really hurt you and I'm really sorry for that. You know, like that's it. I can forgive people real easily when they just own that and say that totally wasn't what I meant, but I'm sorry that that was what you experienced from me. That's it. You know, like we can get through things if we can just do that with each other. And so I think that as individuals, we should be asking and listening to each other, and as organizations and the projects that we're doing, we need to be thinking about those potential unintended consequences. And like, I might not be able to think about all the unintended consequences because they don't affect me. So who else do I need to?
From your perspective. We can go in the same. We can go in the same order. Go ahead.
Also, you want me to start at the end?
Sure.
All right.
Great.
It's so nice to be here, everyone. So I'm just going to start. You know, we are asked to answer the question, what does safety mean to us? And you know, these are conversations that we have had with, you know, many of the partners who we work with. We've had them in small coffee shops. We've had this question on Zoom, and I think one of the things that continues to lift up for us is that what safety means, not just to me, but to so many people, is this idea of belonging, this idea of care, and how we can connect and build relationship to each other. So much of what you said in your intro, Caroline, and I think that was the same for me. You know, when I think about my own neighborhood, and you know, I live in a neighborhood called the Tenderloin in San Francisco, which if you've read any of the Doom Loop press, my neighborhood is the neighborhood that they are talking about. So my neighbors and I talk a lot about safety and what it means. And I think one of the things that we continue coming to is that safety is being in community and building community with each other. You know, we know each other in our street, we know each other on our blocks. And it also means that we look out for each other because we know who is supposed to be there, and when we see someone who we haven't seen before, we want to make sure that they're welcome, and we want to make sure that they have the things that they need to thrive and be successful. I think one of the things we've seen so much in San Francisco is that when our community members don't have the tools that they need to be successful, that is where we start to see the situation, things deteriorating. And so, you know, when we hold safety as both like belonging and caring for each other, then I think we start to see things change for all of us in our community. So just briefly, you talked a little bit about what EJUSA does. You know, and our work really is that, you know, we don't just want a world where violence is rare. We want a world where our neighborhoods are thriving and our communities are happy and excited to be together. And so our work does that in two particular ways. The first is by focusing on reducing the harm of the current system. We know that right now out in the world, the general idea is that justice is punishment. And we at EJUSA believe that justice should actually not be framed as punishment. It should be framed as safety and well-being. And so our work to reduce the harm of the current system is about trying to break that punishment paradigm. And so initially it's really just focusing on those extreme sentences, ending the death penalty, ending solitary confinement, ending life without parole. And as we continue to move forward, really starting to as we break that punishment paradigm, asking the question, what happens after harm? And I think we'll probably get into this at some point, but when we ask questions of, you know, to folks who have either committed harm and who have been harmed, when you ask people what they need, the last thing on the list is harsh punishment. And so our work is really about figuring out how can we like reduce that punishment paradigm and increase the way in which folks have an opportunity to heal and have some kind of reconciliation after violence, and ultimately preventing violence at the front end. And the other piece of our work is this idea of building community power, building community safety. And so my work in this piece of this is around the policy side. And so our work is really designed to figure out how do we open policy space at the state level that allows communities to be centered and be able to talk about what they need to be safe. And so that looks like creating state grant programs so that communities can draw down state funds to actually fund frontline safety work. One example in California, we just passed a piece of legislation that taxes firearms and ammunition at a very small level, and that money will go very specifically to reducing gun violence in our communities, also in our schools, and move towards some safe storage and around firearms. So really, I think our work fits in two pieces, like reducing the harm of the system and then also building up our community capacity and our power to take the reins of their own safety needs.
Hey everybody. Okay. Some things I think you all should know about me. I am a person who uses drugs. I am a violent offender. Bet you didn't know that. And I'm a Jew that supports Palestine. I think, so my background is public health, and public health is like everything. Like everything you can think of in the world contributes to our health. And I think the way that we're defining safety is very similar. Like safety is everything. I know we're talking a lot about the criminal punishment system, but it's also like clean drinking water. That's safety. Like fire response systems that work, having fences around pools, like that's all safety. But I think that this idea of safety that is used in rhetoric that harms other people, it's all about safety from other people, right? It's not safety to be able to take care of ourselves and each other. It's safety from a person doing a thing to you. So yeah, I think that I'm really glad that we're discussing safety and that we can rethink safety together. So the work that Sonoran Prevention Works does is we support people who use drugs and people who've been impacted by drug policy. And we operate from a harm reduction framework. And in harm reduction, it's usually applied to drug use, but it can really be applied to anything. But it's this concept that we accept reality, right? The reality is that people use drugs, whether we like it or not. And so what can we do to reduce some of the harms so that people who are using drugs aren't dying needlessly? We can give out naloxone so that if somebody does experience an overdose, it's not fatal. We can give people syringes so that we're reducing the transmission of HIV and hepatitis C. We can create housing systems that keep people housed even though they're smoking meth, right? And harm reduction comes from the Black Panthers and it comes from the Young Lords. And those groups were like creating safety for themselves because systems were failing them. Right? Nobody else was keeping them safe. Everybody else was challenging their safety and making them unsafe. And so they created a lot of programs for themselves to be safe. And that's where harm reduction comes from. Later on it was feminists fighting for reproductive rights. It was the ACT UP movement in the 80s and 90s to protect people who were dying of AIDS-related complications. So that really is the history of harm reduction. It's not just this like public health thing that like health departments do. We believe that everybody has like freedom to choose what to do with their bodies, and that's safety, right? That people should have freedom from shame and from stigma. That's safety. And drug policy matters for all of us because everybody uses drugs. But there's a couple of you in here who use drugs that are not legal, right?